My stepmother mocked my life-threatening diabetes as a desperate cry for attention until the paramedics demanded to know why my insulin kept vanishing from our own house. I was on the kitchen floor when the paramedics walked in, and Vanessa was laughing. Not a nervous laugh, not shock, a real laugh, the kind she used at dinner parties, light and performative, aimed at the two paramedics kneeling over me like they were an audience she needed to win over. "She does this," she said, waving a hand at me while I lay there gasping, my breath coming in fast, deep holes that didn't feel like enough air no matter how hard I dragged it in. "She gets dramatic when she wants attention. Ever since her dad remarried, honestly." The paramedic closest to me, a woman with a buzzed undercut and a name tag that said Diaz, didn't look up. She had 2 fingers pressed to my wrist and her eyes on a monitor, and I could smell something strange and sweet on my own breath, like nail polish remover, which I'd later learn was the ketones burning through my blood because my body had gone almost 14 hours without a working dose of insulin. "Ma'am, this isn't dramatic," Diaz said. "Her glucose is reading HI. That means it's too high for the machine to even give us a number. She's in diabetic ketoacidosis. That's not attention-seeking. That's organ failure starting. She's a type 1 diabetic, and she's had 2 episodes this month," the other paramedic said, a heavy-set man named Whitfield, flipping through a battered folder Dad kept by the door for exactly this reason. "3rd, if you count the one 3 weeks ago that wasn't even called in." "She's fine," Vanessa said. "She's always fine a few hours later. It's for attention." I wanted to speak. My mouth was too dry. My tongue felt swollen, and every breath came out in that same strange rhythm the paramedics kept watching with narrowed eyes. Deep, rapid, mechanical, the kind of breathing a body does when it's trying to blow off acid it can't get rid of any other way. Somewhere far away, I heard Dad's truck pull into the driveway too late, tires on gravel, a door slamming, his voice already shouting my name before he'd made it through the front door. Diaz started a line for fluids and watched my face the way you watch something you're timing. Then she looked up past me, straight at Vanessa, and her voice changed into something flat and procedural, the voice of someone who has asked a version of this question 100 times before and already suspects the answer. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? Her chart says she's supposed to have a full month's supply of insulin in this house. Pharmacy records say a refill went out 16 days ago. Where is it?" Vanessa's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean, there's an empty lockbox in a bedroom upstairs," Whitfield said, not asking, just reading it off like a fact he already had, because Dad had shown him on the way in. "Scratched to hell around the lock. And a girl on my stretcher who's been in DKA for hours because she had nothing to correct with. So I'm going to ask you again. Where's the insulin?" That's the moment I need you to sit with, because it's the moment I keep coming back to when people ask me how I got through what came after. Not the collapse, not the ambulance. That 1 second where 2 strangers in uniforms looked at my stepmother the way I'd been trying to get my own father to look at her for a year and a half, and I thought, finally, someone else sees it. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed once, no sound coming out, and for the first time since she'd walked into our lives, she didn't have a line ready. I watched that happen from the floor, half my vision swimming, and even sick as I was, I remember thinking, hold on to this. Whatever happens next, hold on to the fact that you saw that. But to understand how we got to that kitchen floor, you have to go back 2 years, to a gymnasium that smelled like rubber and Gatorade, and a 14-year-old girl who didn't know her own body was trying to kill her. I was 14 when I collapsed at basketball practice. It was a Tuesday in October, and I remember the specific humiliation of it more than the fear, at least at first. Going down mid-layup in front of 11 other girls, my legs just stopping like someone had cut a cord. I remember Coach Bell's face upside down over mine, someone's water bottle rolling away across the gym floor, and then very little else until a hospital room at St. Agnes Medical Center with my dad's hand wrapped around mine so tight it hurt. Type 1 diabetes. My pancreas had simply quit, some autoimmune switch flipped for no explainable reason, no family history, no warning. My blood sugar had been over 500 when the ambulance brought me in, and I spent 4 days in the pediatric wing, while a rotating cast of nurses taught my father and me how to count carbohydrates, how to draw insulin into a syringe without air bubbles, how to recognize the difference between a headache and the beginning of a coma. Dad cried at my bedside that first night when he thought I was asleep. I heard him anyway. My mother, Diane, had died 3 years earlier, ovarian cancer, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already winning, and Dad had spent those 3 years being careful with me in a way that sometimes felt like he thought I was made of glass. Now here I was in a hospital bed with a machine beeping out my heart rate, and I think some part of him decided right then that he was never going to let anything sneak up on either of us again. He learned everything, and he learned it faster than I did. He carried glucose tablets in his jacket pocket, in the truck's glove box, in a Ziploc bag zipped into his gym bag. He set 2 in the morning alarms to check my blood sugar while I slept, for months, until my endocrinologist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Reeves, told him gently that he needed to trust me to wake up on my own sometimes, that hovering wasn't sustainable for either of us. Dad backed off, but only a little. For 6 months after my diagnosis, it was just the 2 of us, learning a new language together, eating dinner at the same time every night so my doses stayed predictable. And for the first time since Mom died, our house felt like it had settled into something steady. I used to fall asleep on the couch some nights with the TV on low and Dad reading in his recliner across the room, and I remember thinking, in the uncomplicated way a 14-year-old thinks things, that we were going to be okay. Just the two of us. Okay. Then Vanessa showed up. She worked in the same office building as Dad, 3 floors up, ran a wellness consulting business out of a rented suite with her name stenciled on frosted glass. Vanessa Cole Wellness, a company that sold supplements and detox protocols to women who could afford them. She had shiny dark hair that always looked freshly blown out and a laugh that arrived a half second too fast, like she'd rehearsed the timing. Dad met her at a building mixer in April. By June, they were dating. By the following March, 11 months after that first mixer, they were married in the backyard of a rental venue 40 minutes outside Brackenridge. And Vanessa moved into our house the same week like she'd been planning the floor plan for months. My mother's photographs came off the mantle within the first 10 days. Not thrown away. Vanessa was careful about that. Careful in the specific way people are when they know exactly how something will look if it's ever brought up later. Just relocated to a box in the garage, replaced with framed prints of beach houses and inspirational quotes in cursive script. I told myself I'd adjust. I told myself a lot of things that year. There was one incident early on, before any of the insulin trouble started, that I didn't think much of at the time and have thought about constantly since. 6 weeks after the wedding, we drove to a rented cabin in Hocking Hills for what Vanessa called a family bonding trip, 4 hours from home. I packed my own bag the night before, the way I always did. Glucose tablets, backup pens, alcohol swabs, my meter, all zipped into a soft-sided cooler bag I kept by the front door specifically so nobody would forget it. Vanessa insisted on loading the car herself that morning, said she wanted to be helpful, and somehow in the loading, my cooler bag never made it out of the front hall closet. We didn't discover it was missing until we were an hour outside Brackenridge, already committed to the drive. I remember the particular flavor of panic that set in, doing math in my head about how many hours I had before my current pen ran dry. Dad gripping the wheel with both hands while Vanessa, in the passenger seat, said brightly, "Well, we'll just find a pharmacy up there. It's not a big deal, you're being dramatic." We spent the first 2 hours of that trip locating a rural pharmacy 40 minutes from the cabin that carried my brand, paying out of pocket because it was a different location than our usual one, and the insurance system flagged it as too early for a refill. $290 cash for a single pen that should have been sitting in my bag the whole time. Vanessa apologized in the vague, weightless way she apologized for most things. I must have grabbed the wrong bag. These things happen, and I let it go because it was early, and because I wanted badly for this to work. I didn't understand yet that I'd just watched a preview. What I also didn't know, and wouldn't learn until much later, was that the cabin trip fell exactly 9 days after Vanessa had quietly taken out a business loan of $41,000 to relaunch her supplement company under a new name. I didn't know she was already behind on payments before we'd even finished unpacking from the honeymoon. I didn't know any of the financial pressure sitting underneath her sunny, distracted mood that weekend, and I wouldn't connect it to my missing cooler bag for a long time. At 15, I only knew that my medicine had been left behind, and that somehow, by the end of the conversation in the car, I was the one who'd been asked to apologize for making a fuss. The real pattern started about 4 months later, not long after the honeymoon glow had worn fully off. It began small enough that I doubted myself. I'd leave my pens in the kitchen drawer where they'd lived since my diagnosis, and I'd find them relocated to the medicine cabinet in the hallway bathroom, mixed in with cold medicine and old prescription bottles. "I was organizing," Vanessa said the first time I asked, rolling her eyes like I was being precious about it. "It's medicine. It goes with the other medicine." I explained as calmly as I could that insulin needed to be somewhere I'd actually look for it in an emergency, somewhere consistent, and she told me I was being controlling for a 15-year-old. A few weeks after that, my backup vials, the ones I kept refrigerated for when my in-use pens ran low, turned up shoved to the back of the fridge behind a container of leftover lasagna. $438 a vial, even with insurance, buried behind Tupperware like a science project nobody wanted to look at. When I found them, I stood in the kitchen holding 2 boxes of medication that kept me alive, and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold, a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. At dinner that week, Vanessa watched me test my blood sugar before eating. A small ritual, prick the finger, wait 5 seconds, adjust the dose, and made a face like I'd done something rude at the table. "That's disgusting," she said. "Can't you do that somewhere else? My nephew's diabetic too, type 2, and he just handles it quietly, in the bathroom, like a normal person." I told her evenly that I had to test right before eating because timing mattered, that doing it 10 minutes early or in another room could throw off the whole calculation and send me too high or too low. She smiled the way adults smile at children who've said something they think is very important and isn't. "Well," she said, "I just think there's a way to do things and a way to make everyone at the table uncomfortable." A week after that came the natural healing conversations, and looking back now, I understand they weren't really about me at all. Vanessa had strong opinions about big pharma and insulin companies wanting people dependent forever. She said that with the right diet, the right supplements, my body could wake up and start producing insulin again on its own. I told her, as patiently as a 15-year-old could manage, that wasn't how an autoimmune disease worked, that my pancreas hadn't gone on strike. It had been destroyed by my own immune system and wasn't coming back regardless of kale intake. She just smiled and said I'd understand when I was older that doctors didn't want people to know the truth because sick people were profitable. I didn't understand yet that she had her own reasons to need that story to be true. That would come later, and it would explain more than I wanted it to. What I noticed, without understanding it, was that Vanessa had started taking pictures. Little things, my testing supplies laid out on the counter, my continuous glucose monitor sensor visible on the back of my arm, once even the lockbox itself before I'd started using it, angled so the label with my name and Dr. Reeves's clinic was legible. She always had an excuse ready if I caught her at it. For a wellness board I'm building, she said once, vaguely, when I asked why she'd photographed my glucose meter on the kitchen table. I filed it away the way I filed away most things that year, a small wrongness with no clear shape yet, and went back to my homework. I wouldn't understand what those photographs were actually for until months later, and by the time I did, the shape of it made my stomach turn in a way the DKA never had. 2 weeks after the natural healing conversation, I found 4 of my insulin pens in the kitchen trash. Actual garbage, coffee grounds stuck to the caps, a banana peel wrapped around one of them, 8 months from their expiration date, close to $400, easily, sitting in a trash bag under the sink. When I confronted her, she said she'd grabbed the wrong things while cleaning out the fridge, an explanation that made no sense given the pens had been in the medicine cabinet, not the fridge. But Dad wanted to believe her, and I was tired of being the girl who fought with her stepmother over everything, so I let it go. I didn't believe her, but I let it go. Then she told the story at Thanksgiving. We were at my grandmother's house, 12 people around a table built for 8, and Vanessa turned my hypoglycemic episode from 2 weeks earlier, the one where I'd had to eat glucose tablets at my locker because I felt the shaking start, the cold sweat, the tunnel vision, into a punchline. She's so dramatic about her little diabetes, she said, laughing, reaching for the gravy like she hadn't just said something that made my face go hot with humiliation. My Uncle Gary, who'd had 3 beers and never met a joke he wouldn't laugh at to keep the peace, chuckled along. My grandmother Rose didn't. Dad's jaw tightened, and he told Vanessa quietly that it wasn't funny. She said, just as quietly, that I needed to learn to laugh at myself, that I was too sensitive, that everyone in this family walked on eggshells around my diagnosis, and it wasn't healthy. I sat there with a plate of turkey I couldn't eat and thought about my mother, who used to let me help her cook on holidays, who never would have let anyone laugh at me for something I didn't choose. My blood sugar log started turning erratic that winter, spikes and crashes with no pattern I could explain by diet or exercise, the kind of chaos that shows up when doses get missed or delayed. Dr. Reeves reviewed my numbers at a routine appointment in January and asked carefully whether I was really taking my doses correctly, whether I understood the timing. I didn't have an answer that didn't sound insane. I couldn't say my stepmother keeps hiding my medicine to a man in a white coat without sounding like I was inventing a conspiracy, so I just said I'd try to be more careful and drove home with Dad in a silence that had a shape to it, heavy and specific, neither of us naming what we both suspected. Around the same time, Vanessa started working on the rest of the family, one relative at a time, in ways that felt harmless in the moment and only added up later. She'd call my grandmother Rose to check in, and somewhere in the conversation she'd mention gently how exhausting it was to manage a household with a sick teenager, how she worried the constant focus on my blood sugar was making Dad anxious, how she just wanted everyone to relax a little. She brought Uncle Gary a case of his favorite beer for his birthday, and told him, over the grill, that she sometimes felt like the villain in her own house for asking me to be a little more normal about my testing. She was building a chorus before she ever needed one, laying track for the version of events where she was the reasonable one surrounded by an overreacting family. She used money too, in smaller ways than people expect. Dad had started keeping a rough tally of what my supplies cost each month: insulin, test strips, the continuous glucose monitor sensors that ran nearly $90 every 10 days, even with insurance. And Vanessa began referencing that tally in arguments that had nothing to do with money. "I'm not saying it's your fault," she told him once, when he'd mentioned wanting to take an extra shift to cover a specialist copay. "I'm just saying we never have any breathing room, and I don't think it's fair that I have to feel guilty every time I want something for myself." Dad, who had spent 3 years grieving my mother and 18 months trying to make a new marriage work, absorbed that guilt the way he absorbed most things Vanessa handed him, quietly and alone. There was a night in February I still think about, when I overheard her on the phone in the garage, a habit of hers taking calls where she thought no one could hear, telling someone in a voice pitched low and urgent that it's not sustainable, not with everything else going on right now. I didn't know what everything else meant. I assumed at the time she was talking about me. I was half right. The pens started disappearing completely that spring, not relocated, gone. 6 pens down to 4, then 4 down to 1, over the course of about 3 weeks. I started photographing my supply every morning before school, a habit that felt paranoid and necessary at the same time, the way checking a lock twice feels paranoid right up until the one night you needed to. When 2 pens vanished overnight between a Tuesday and a Wednesday, I showed Dad the photos, side by side, 6 pens Tuesday morning, 4 pens Wednesday morning, nothing else in the house disturbed. He confronted Vanessa in the kitchen while I stood in the hallway, listening. She acted stunned, genuinely stunned, the kind of performance that made me briefly doubt my own photographs, and then, smooth as anything, turned it around on me. "Teenagers hide things for attention, Frank," she said, "especially ones who feel replaced. Have you considered she's doing this to herself, to get you to focus on her again?" I want to tell you Dad shut that down immediately. He didn't. He came to me that night and asked gently whether there was any chance at all, that I was the one moving my own medication. I remember exactly where I was standing, at the foot of my bed, when he asked me that. I told him no. I told him I would never do that to myself, that I understood better than anyone what happened to a body without insulin. He believed me mostly, but I could see the doubt Vanessa had planted sitting behind his eyes like a splinter he couldn't quite work out. Around that same time, Vanessa started developing symptoms of her own, vague, shifting ones, a headache that kept her in bed on nights Dad had planned to sit down with me and go over my quarterly labs, a flare of some unspecified autoimmune issue she'd never mentioned before that always seemed to peak whenever attention in the house tilted toward me for too long. I don't say this to diagnose her, and I want to be careful here, because I'm not a doctor, and I don't know what she was or wasn't actually experiencing. What I know is the pattern. Every time Dr. Reeves adjusted my insulin ratios, every time I had a school presentation about living with a chronic illness, every time my grandmother asked to take me to an appointment alone, Vanessa developed something that needed tending to instead. Dad, conditioned by 3 years of losing my mother to a disease that really had been invisible until it wasn't, took her symptoms seriously every time, the way a good and frightened man does. I watched him split himself in half trying to be present for both of us, and I watched Vanessa's ailments resolve, almost without exception, within a day or two of getting the attention they'd been engineered to summon. That was the night I decided to lock everything up. I bought a small metal lockbox with my own money, $42 from a hardware store 2 towns over so Vanessa wouldn't see the receipt, and I kept my pens and vials inside it, in my closet. Combination known only to me and eventually my father. For 2 weeks there was peace. Actual blessed peace. The first stretch of calm I'd had in over a year. Then I came home from a study session at the library and found the box on my bed, forced open, scratch marks scoring the metal around the lock like someone had worked at it with a screwdriver for a long time, before giving up on patience and using force. Empty. My emergency vial in the fridge, the one I kept as backup in case the lockbox was ever compromised, I'd never told anyone about that one except Dad, was gone too. I had roughly 3 hours before I'd start climbing into dangerous numbers, and nothing left in the house to give myself. I didn't make it 3 hours. Dad wasn't home yet. A delayed shipment had him stuck at the warehouse an extra 90 minutes, and by the time I felt the first wave of nausea, the dry mouth that no amount of water seemed to fix, I already knew what was happening even as some panicked, stubborn part of me kept hoping I was wrong. I called him at the 2-hour mark, my voice already strange to my own ears, and he broke every speed limit between the warehouse and our house. I called 911 9 minutes after that, when my breathing changed into that deep, rapid pattern I'd later learn was called Kussmaul breathing, my body trying to blow carbon dioxide out fast enough to compensate for the acid building up in my blood. I remember sliding down the kitchen cabinet to the floor because standing had stopped feeling like an option. I remember Vanessa coming downstairs to see what the noise was, and I remember, even through the fog of it, being aware of her face doing something complicated when she saw me on the floor with the phone still in my hand. That's the scene I opened this story with. The paramedics, the glucometer that couldn't find a number, Vanessa's laugh, Diaz's question that finally landed somewhere true. I won't make you sit through it twice. What I'll tell you instead is what happened in the minutes after Whitfield asked her where the insulin was a second time. She didn't answer. Not really. She said something about how teenagers exaggerate, how she'd never touched my medication, how this whole family had turned into a courtroom, but her voice had lost its rhythm, the performance running out of material in real time. Diaz didn't push further. She had a patient to stabilize, but she made a note on her clipboard before we left for St. Agnes, and she told my father, quietly, at the door, that what she'd seen tonight was worth reporting regardless of how the hospital visit went. I remember one more thing from the ambulance ride, small and strange, the kind of detail that lodges itself somewhere and doesn't let go. Vanessa rode in the front of the truck Dad drove behind us. She'd insisted on coming, said it would look bad if she stayed home, and through the back windows of the ambulance, I could see our house getting smaller, porch light on, the kitchen window lit up yellow behind it. I thought about my mother, who I barely let myself think about most days because it still hurt in a specific, physical way behind my sternum, and I thought, with a kind of clarity that only shows up when your body is in crisis, that she would have known. She would have looked at Vanessa across a dinner table 18 months ago and known exactly what she was looking at. I didn't have her instincts yet. I was still learning them, one stolen pen at a time. I spent 6 hours in the emergency room that night, getting my blood chemistry back into a range that wouldn't kill me. Somewhere in those 6 hours, my father called the police from the hospital waiting room, and an officer named Patel met us at the house afterward, once I'd been discharged with a stack of new prescriptions and a stern lecture about supply redundancy that felt almost funny, given the redundancy hadn't been the problem. Patel walked through the house that night, noted no forced entry at any door or window, no other valuables disturbed, nothing missing except medication that belonged to a minor with a documented life-threatening condition. He looked at Vanessa for a long moment when he asked whether there was any conflict in the household. "Of course not," she said, smiling the smile she used for people in uniforms. He left us a case number and a piece of advice that would end up mattering more than anything else that happened that year. "Get a camera," he said. "I can't do anything without evidence. Right now, this is your word against hers." I lay awake most of that night going over his words, my word against hers. I'd had a year and a half of that particular equation occasion, and I'd lost almost every round of it. Every relocated pen explained away, every missing vial turned into my own carelessness, every honest fear repackaged as attention-seeking until I'd half started to believe it myself. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the IV bruise already purpling on the inside of my elbow, and I thought about Vanessa's laugh in the kitchen, easy and unbothered, like watching me gasp for air had been mildly inconveniencing rather than horrifying. Something in me that had spent a year and a half trying to be reasonable, trying to be patient, trying to give her the benefit of every doubt my father kept extending her, finally ran out. I decided, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that I was done losing it. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. So I bought a camera, a small motion-activated one, the kind that streams to an app on your phone and sends an alert the second it detects movement. Paid for with birthday money I'd been saving for something else entirely. I tucked it behind a stack of old yearbooks on my bookshelf, angled so it caught the closet door and nothing else. My grandmother had given me a heavier lockbox for my birthday that spring, half joking that it looked like something you'd keep a gun in, and I'd started using it instead of the one with the scratched-up lock. I didn't tell Dad about the camera. I didn't tell anyone. If I was wrong, if some part of Vanessa's story was somehow true, and I really had lost my mind the way she kept insisting, I didn't think I could survive being wrong out loud. And if I was right, I needed something nobody could argue with. Not photographs of pen counts, not a locked door with scratch marks, something with a timestamp and a face. For 3 days, nothing happened. I started to wonder if buying the camera had been its own kind of paranoia, if I'd finally tipped over into the thing Vanessa kept accusing me of being. And then, on the 4th day, a Thursday, my phone buzzed during fifth period with a motion alert, and that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat on my bathroom floor with the volume turned all the way down and watched 2 in the afternoon unfold on a 4-inch screen. The house was empty except for her. She walked into my room like she had every right to be there, which I suppose in her mind she did. She went straight to the lockbox and pulled a small case of tools from her cardigan pocket. Tools she'd clearly brought with her for exactly this purpose, not grabbed in a moment of impulse. 15 minutes and 11 seconds, time stamped in the corner of the frame, her face lit by the closet light the whole time, no mistaking who it was. When the lock finally gave, she took 4 pens, left the box open on my bed exactly the way I'd find it 2 hours later, and walked out of frame without once looking rushed. Before she left, though, she did something I hadn't expected. She took out her phone and photographed the open box, the loose pens still inside it, my name visible on the prescription label taped to the lid. The same habit I'd half noticed for months, filed away as a strange quirk. On camera, in real time, it stopped looking like a quirk and started looking like documentation. I didn't cry watching it. I remember that surprising me. I'd expected to cry. Instead, I felt something settle into place, cold and clear, like a held breath finally releasing. I brought my phone downstairs to where Dad was reading in his recliner, sat down across from him without a word, and hit play. His face changed within the first 10 seconds. I watched him go through something I can only describe as the collapse of a story he'd been telling himself for a year and a half, that his wife was difficult sometimes, but not cruel, careless sometimes, but not calculated. He rewound it and watched it again, then a third time, slower, his jaw working the whole way through. "Vanessa," he called out, and his voice had a crack in it I'd never heard before, not even at Mom's funeral. She came in from the kitchen already smiling, the smile that had gotten her through a year and a half of accusations she'd always managed to turn back on me, and the smile stayed frozen on her face for exactly as long as it took her to see what was paused on the screen. "That's not what it looks like," she said. "That video's been edited somehow. They can do anything with video now, Frank. It has a timestamp," Dad said. "It has your face. It has you using a screwdriver on our daughter's lockbox and then photographing it like a trophy." "Our daughter," she repeated, like the words tasted wrong. "She is not my daughter. And frankly, the way you two have treated me since I moved in, you've been stealing medication from a child," Dad said, and his voice had gone somewhere flat and cold I didn't know he had in him. "That's not organizing a medicine cabinet, Vanessa. That's not a wellness board. That's what a judge is going to call abuse if it comes to that." Her face did something complicated at the word judge, a flicker I'd remember later and understand differently. She switched tactics the way she always did, fast, tears arriving right on schedule, the same tears she'd used at Thanksgiving when Dad first pushed back on the little diabetes joke. "You're choosing her over me," she said. "You've always chosen her over me. She's been poisoning you against me since the day I moved in, and you're too blind to see it. Pack a bag," Dad said. "You're leaving tonight." For a second, she just stood there, breathing hard, and I watched something calculate behind her eyes, some fast internal math I didn't understand yet. Then she grabbed her phone off the counter and dialed a number with shaking hands, turned her back to us, and started talking low and fast to someone on the other end. I caught fragments. "I need you to say something. You have to back me up. This is getting out of control." And then she went very still and turned around slowly, her face drained of color. "They already called you?" she said into the phone, staring straight at my father. "Why would the hospital already have called you?" Dad's face changed instantly. He hadn't gotten any call from any hospital. Neither had I. And that was the moment the floor tilted under all 3 of us at once, because whoever was on the other end of that call knew something none of us did yet, something that had been happening in parallel to everything I'd just shown my father, something that had had nothing to do with a lockbox or a camera. The person on the other end was Vanessa's sister, Renee, and what Renee told her in a panic was that someone from St. Agnes Medical Center's social work department had left a voicemail that afternoon for my father, not for Vanessa, a fact Vanessa hadn't known yet when she made that call, asking him to schedule a meeting regarding a pattern of concern in my recent emergency room visits. Renee had heard the voicemail because it had gone to a shared family email account Vanessa had set up years earlier and never fully separated from her sister's inbox, an old habit of convenience about to become one of the worst decisions of her life. Here is what none of us understood yet, standing in that living room. I'd been to St. Agnes's emergency room 4 times in the 14 months since Vanessa moved in, each time for a severe episode traceable, in hindsight, to periods when my insulin had mysteriously run short. A social worker named Patricia Nguyen had noticed the pattern before any of us did, cross-referencing my chart against pharmacy refill records that showed insulin being picked up from the pharmacy on schedule every single month without fail. Refills authorized under Vanessa's name as my listed emergency caregiver. Since Dad's shift work sometimes had him traveling for his job, the insulin was being purchased. It simply wasn't in the house. Nguyen had started building a file 2 months earlier, quietly, the way hospital social workers are trained to when they suspect medical neglect but don't yet have enough to escalate to Child Protective Services. She'd been the one to leave that voicemail, and she'd been the one, unbeknownst to any of us that night, who had also received a message that same week from a stranger named Catherine Ostrander, forwarded through St. Agnes's General Patient Advocacy line. Catherine was a mother in Columbus, 2 hours from Brackenridge, whose own son was a type 1 diabetic, and who moderated a small volunteer Facebook group called the Ohio Diabetic Supply Exchange, a page built to help families trade extra insulin and supplies at cost when insurance came up short, the kind of quiet, decent mutual aid network that exists in almost every chronic illness community, run by people who understand exactly how expensive staying alive can be. 2 months earlier, a seller using the handle VC Supplies had started posting boxes of unopened, in-date insulin pens for sale at $80 each, well under pharmacy price. A bargain good enough that Catherine had almost bought a box herself before something made her pause. The lot numbers. Catherine's son used the same insulin brand, and she'd developed, over years of managing his prescriptions, an eye for the small printed batch codes on the boxes, codes she recognized because insurance sometimes required her to document them for reimbursement. 2 of the lot numbers, VC. Supplies had posted for sale matched, almost exactly. A batch her own pharmacist had mentioned was on regional backorder that same month, meaning very few pharmacies in the state would have even had that lot in stock. On a hunch, she messaged the seller asking where the supply was coming from, and got a vague, defensive answer about family surplus that didn't sit right. She reported the listing to the group's moderators, and, out of an abundance of caution that would end up mattering more than she could have known, she also flagged it to St. Agnes's advocacy line, since the seller's profile listed Brackenridge as her location, and St. Agnes was the regional hospital most likely to have a patient connected to it. That flag landed on Patricia Nguyen's desk the same week she'd already started quietly investigating my chart. We didn't learn any of that until 2 days after the confrontation in the living room, when Nguyen called Dad directly and asked to meet. But standing in that room the night Vanessa's face went pale over the phone, we didn't need the details yet to understand the shape of what was happening. Vanessa understood it before either of us did. That's what the color draining from her face had meant. Somewhere, a professional with a file and a caseworker's patience had already started connecting dots that Vanessa had spent a year and a half insisting didn't exist. Dad called my grandmother before he called anyone else, standing in the backyard so I wouldn't hear him if his voice broke, though I heard most of it anyway through the screen door. "I let her tell me our daughter was lying for over a year, Mom," he said, and I heard Rose's voice, tinny and indignant through the phone speaker, telling him it wasn't too late to fix it, that fixing it started tonight. He came back inside with his eyes red-rimmed and sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table Vanessa had made jokes at, and he said, "I should have believed you the first time you showed me those photos." I told him I understood why he hadn't, that Vanessa was good at what she did, that it wasn't only his fault. He shook his head like he didn't quite accept the forgiveness yet, and maybe he was right not to. Some things take longer than one conversation to actually repair. She left that night, not gracefully. She packed 2 suitcases while Dad stood in the doorway of their bedroom with his arms crossed, and she cried the whole time, alternating between apology and accusation in a way that would have worked on him 18 months earlier, and simply didn't anymore. "You're going to regret this," she told him at the front door. Mascara tracked down her face. "You have no idea what you're throwing away." Dad didn't answer her. He just held the door until she was through it, and locked it behind her, and then he came and sat next to me on the couch, and didn't say anything for a long time. 2 days later, Dad and I sat across from Patricia Nguyen in a small office at St. Agnes, with a box of tissues on the table that neither of us needed, as it turned out, because we were mostly just numb. She walked us through the pattern she'd found, the 4 ER visits, the pharmacy records, the timeline that lined up almost exactly with the periods when I'd photographed dwindling pen counts on my phone. She was careful, professional, and kind in a way that made the whole thing feel less like an accusation, and more like a diagnosis finally being written down correctly after a year of being misread. She told us the hospital would not be pursuing anything against my father, that the pattern clearly implicated a single household member and not a parenting failure, and that she'd be filing a formal report that would likely be relevant to both the divorce proceedings and, depending on what law enforcement decided to do with it, a possible criminal case. She told us, too, how the process would work from here, that her report would go to both the county's Children's Services Division and separately to the Brackenridge Police Department, since criminal theft of a controlled substance fell outside her office's jurisdiction to handle alone. She explained that a detective would likely want to interview me directly, that I should expect to tell this story again, probably more than once, to people who hadn't watched the footage and didn't have the context I did. I know that's not easy, she said, sliding a business card across the table with a victim advocate's number on it. Someone I could call if the process ever felt like too much. Dad asked whether the 4 ER visits alone would have been enough, without the camera, without the Facebook tip. Nguyen considered the question carefully before answering, the way I'd come to understand professionals in her position always did, weighing honesty against reassurance. Probably eventually, she said, but it would have taken longer and probably one more emergency room visit at minimum. You two got here faster than most families do. That matters. Dad asked her quietly what Catherine Ostrander's tip had actually shown. Nguyen slid a printed screenshot across the table. The VC supplies listing, 4 boxes of insulin pens, $80 each, posted from an account with a profile photo of a woman standing on a beach that I recognized instantly because it was the same photo Vanessa used on her wellness company's website. Underneath the listing, in the comments, was a short exchange between the seller and Catherine, polite and evasive, ending with the seller writing, "Just family surplus, my stepdaughter switched insurance and had extra." A lie so specific and so casually cruel that I read it 3 times before I could feel anything about it at all. Later, once the divorce filing had made certain records available, we learned the fuller shape of it. Vanessa's supplement company, relaunched 18 months earlier as Radiant Roots after a $41,000 loan she'd never disclosed to my father, had been 3 payments behind to a collections agency called Meridian Recovery Group by the time she married him. The natural healing conversations, the insistence that my body could wake up on its own, hadn't only been ideology, they'd been market research. A social media consultant she'd hired months earlier had told her, in an email that later surfaced in Discovery, that testimonial content, real transformation stories, the consultant called them, performed 3 times better than product photography, and that a family testimonial would be the strongest asset Radiant Roots could have. Vanessa had been quietly photographing my supplies for months, building a file of images she apparently intended to use, someday, as evidence of an illness she was hoping to convince people didn't have to be permanent. Selling the diverted pens on the side had been a simpler, faster stream of cash for a business already drowning $80 at a time, funneled straight into payments to Meridian Recovery Group to keep her creditors quiet a little longer. None of it had ever really been about me. I understood that clearly for the first time sitting in Nguyen's office, and it didn't make it easier. In some ways, it made it worse. I'd spent a year and a half thinking I was the target of something personal, some specific dislike Vanessa had for me, and it turned out I'd just been a resource, a story she needed, a body she could siphon medication from while telling everyone, including herself, that she was helping. The financial picture came out slowly, in pieces. Over the months the divorce attorney spent untangling Vanessa's accounts from my father's. A forensic accountant Dad's lawyer brought in found the loan documents first. The $41,000 from a regional bank, co-signed by no one, taken out under the Radiant Roots business name 8 weeks before the wedding. Then came the collections notices, 11 of them over 14 months, addressed to a PO. Box Vanessa had rented specifically so they wouldn't arrive at our house. Then, buried in an old laptop Dad found in a closet she hadn't bothered to clean out, the email from her marketing consultant, the one about testimonial content performing 3 times better than product photography, sitting in a folder labeled, with an ordinariness that still makes my stomach turn, Q3 growth ideas. There were logistics too, the unglamorous kind nobody warns you about when a marriage collapses over something like this. Vanessa's name was still on the joint checking account, and for 11 days after she left, Dad couldn't move money without her signature while their divorce attorney worked to get it frozen and split. A pharmacy autopay bounced during those 11 days, and Dad had to drive to the counter and pay cash for a refill while a line built up behind him. The same brand of quiet public humiliation Vanessa had put me through so many times, landing on him instead for once. He didn't complain about it. He just paid it and drove home, and I think some part of him needed to feel, even briefly, a fraction of what the last year and a half had cost me. The weeks after Vanessa left the house were louder than I expected grief to be. Word moved through the extended family fast, the way it does, and people took sides with a speed that told me a lot about who had actually been paying attention all along. My grandmother Rose, who'd never liked Vanessa and had said so quietly at every holiday, showed up at our house the day after the confrontation with a casserole and didn't leave for 6 hours. My uncle Gary, who'd laughed at the Thanksgiving joke, called Dad 2 weeks later, apologized in the stilted, uncomfortable way men of his generation apologize, and told him he'd had no idea, that Vanessa had always seemed so put together, and that he was sorry for laughing. I believed him. It didn't make the memory of laughing along any less painful, but I believed him. My grandmother started coming to my endocrinology appointments after that, sitting in the corner of Dr. Reeves's office with a notepad, writing down every every instruction like she was making up for a year and a half of not being close enough to catch what was happening. I didn't ask her to. She just started showing up, and I let her, because it turned out I'd been hungry for that particular kind of unglamorous, attentive love for longer than I'd realized. Not everyone landed where I expected. Renee, Vanessa's sister, called our house once, tearfully, asking Dad to just talk to her, to consider that Vanessa had been under a lot of stress and hadn't meant for things to get so out of hand. Dad listened for exactly as long as it took Renee to finish her sentence, and then told her evenly that stress didn't explain 15 months of stolen insulin, and hung up. Vanessa herself made 3 more attempts at contact that I know of. A long, rambling email to Dad's work address that his HR department flagged as inappropriate. A single, unanswered voicemail to my phone, her voice thick with something that might have been real regret or might have been the same performance, recalibrated for a smaller audience. And one afternoon, about 5 weeks after she left, when she was waiting in the parking lot after school, standing by her car like she had every right to be there. I saw her before she saw me. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair a little flatter, her car a used sedan instead of the leased crossover she'd driven when she lived with us. I remember the particular vertigo of it. My stepmother standing in a school parking lot full of my classmates, backpacks and skateboards, and someone's music playing too loud from an open car window. And I remember deciding in about 2 seconds that I wasn't going to run from this the way I'd run from every other confrontation with her for a year and a half. "I just want to talk," she said when I got close enough. "You don't understand what this has done to me, Nora. My business is gone. People online found the Facebook thing. They're saying things about me that aren't even—" "You sold my medicine," I said. "It came out steadier than I expected. You almost let me die. Twice that we know about. Maybe more. I never wanted you to get hurt," she said. And for one strange second, I almost believed her, because I think she almost believed herself. "You have to understand the position I was in." "I don't have to understand anything," I said. "I'm 16. I had ketones in my blood at 14% while you told 2 paramedics I was faking it. You don't get an explanation from me. You get a police report." "Nora, please," she said, and her voice cracked in a way that, for the first time in a year and a half, didn't move me at all. "I did love you, in my own way. You have to know that." "I don't have to know anything," I said. "That's the part you never understood. You spent a year and a half deciding what I was allowed to feel, and what I was allowed to say, and what counted as dramatic. I don't owe you my understanding anymore. I barely owed it to you then." I turned and walked to my dad's truck, which had just pulled into the lot, tires too fast for the speed limit because a teacher had called him the second she saw Vanessa's car. I didn't look back. I heard her call my name once, and then I heard nothing else, because Dad's door was already open and I was already inside it. There was a criminal case eventually, though it took longer than any of us expected, and resolved smaller than I wanted it to. Vanessa was charged with theft of a controlled substance and endangering the welfare of a minor. Her attorney negotiated the endangerment charge down in exchange for a guilty plea on the theft, and the case moved to sentencing 9 months after the night in the kitchen. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, fluorescent lit, half empty except for us, and a court reporter and a public defender who kept checking her watch. The judge, a tired-looking woman named Halloran, gave the victim's family a chance to speak before sentencing, and Dad's lawyer had warned me I could decline if it felt like too much. I didn't decline. I stood up in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and said the thing I'd been rehearsing in my head for months, my voice shaking for the first sentence and then steadying, the way I'd noticed it did whenever I stopped worrying about whether Vanessa believed me and started just saying what was true. I told Judge Halloran that I'd been 14 when I was diagnosed, that I'd learned to keep myself alive with a level of vigilance most adults never have to learn, and that for a year and a half, the person my father trusted to help protect that vigilance had instead treated my survival as an inconvenience, and eventually as inventory. I told her I wasn't asking for anger on my behalf. I was asking that the record reflect what actually happened, because I'd spent too long having what actually happened rewritten by someone with a better performance than mine. Vanessa didn't look at me while I spoke. She was sentenced to 18 months of probation, mandatory restitution of the pharmacy costs Dad had paid out of pocket over the 15 months, just over $6,000 once everything was added up, and a permanent note in a state registry that would follow any future work involving vulnerable people. Radiant Roots folded within the year, the Facebook exposure having done more damage to her client list than the legal proceedings ever could. I heard, secondhand, through Renee, that Vanessa moved to Cincinnati not long after, started over under a version of her maiden name, and I haven't heard anything since, which is exactly the amount of information about her I want in my life at this point. Renee, for what it's worth, sent me a Christmas card that year, unsigned by Vanessa, just Renee's own handwriting wishing me well and hoping I was healthy. I keep it in a drawer. I haven't decided yet what to do with the fact that she reached out at all, separate from her sister, on her own. Some relationships don't resolve into clean categories. I've learned to let a few of them stay unresolved rather than force them into a shape that isn't true. At school, word got around faster than I expected, the way it does in a town the size of Brackenridge. I'd braced myself for pity, or worse, for the same disbelief I'd gotten at home for a year and a half. Instead, a girl named Priya Chandra, who I barely knew outside of AP chemistry, found me at my locker one afternoon and told me quietly that her older brother was type 1 too, and that she'd believe me over anyone who'd ever called a diabetic dramatic. Coach Bell pulled me aside after practice one day, not long after the story had made its way through the parent group chats, and told me she'd noticed things over the years. A stepmother who never never came to games, a girl who sometimes looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with conditioning drills, and she was sorry she hadn't asked more questions. I told her it wasn't her job to catch what my own family had missed. She said maybe not, but she wished she'd tried anyway. I've thought about that conversation a lot since. Sometimes the people who show up aren't the ones you expect, and sometimes the ones who fail you aren't the villains of the story. Just people who didn't look closely enough, the way almost all of us don't, most of the time, about most things. I want to be honest about something, because this story would be a lie if I made it sound like everything after that was simple relief. There were nights, months later, when I found myself grieving something I couldn't quite name. Not Vanessa, not really, but the version of a stepmother I'd let myself hope for. Briefly, in the early days before the pen started moving. I'd wanted a family that felt whole again after my mother died. I'd wanted, for about 6 months, to believe Vanessa could be part of that. Losing that hope hurt in a way that was separate from the theft, separate from the DKA, separate from the parking lot confrontation. It was its own smaller grief tucked inside the larger one, and I don't think it ever fully goes away. I don't think it's supposed to. The divorce finalized 14 months after Vanessa left the house. Dad sold the house we'd shared with her. His choice, not mine, though I didn't argue. And we moved into a smaller place across town, closer to my grandmother, with a kitchen half the size of the old one, and a mantel that has held my mother's photographs, undisturbed, for 2 years now. Dad still checks in on my blood sugar more than most fathers of 16-year-olds probably do, but it doesn't feel like hovering anymore. It feels like a habit two people built together out of necessity that turned into something closer to trust. I keep my insulin in the kitchen now, in the same drawer it lived in during those first 6 months after my diagnosis. Before Vanessa, before any of it. Nobody moves it. Nobody has to lock a box in a closet to keep it safe. Dr. Reeves tells me my numbers are the most stable they've been since I was 14, and I believe him because I can feel it. The specific, unglamorous relief of a body that isn't being sabotaged by someone who's supposed to be protecting it. I'm a junior now. I made varsity again this year, the same sport I collapsed playing when this whole thing started, and Coach Bell still keeps a spare juice box in her office for me without ever making a production of it. Dad comes to almost every game. Grandma Rose comes to most of them too, sitting beside him in the same folding chair every time, still writing things down in that notepad from Dr. Reeves's office, though these days it's mostly just the score. Dad started dating again this past spring, cautiously, almost apologetically, like he needed my permission before he let himself consider it. I gave it to him. Not because I've forgotten what happened, but because I refused to let what Vanessa did become the reason my father spends the rest of his life alone, checking every new person against a fear he shouldn't have to carry forever. He's careful now in a different way than before. He asks more questions. He watches longer before he trusts, and I think that's a fair trade for what it cost him to learn it. People ask me sometimes why I don't seem angrier than I am when I tell this story. I've thought about that a lot. I think the anger is still there, underneath, but it's not the loudest thing anymore. What's loudest now is something closer to clarity. The understanding that the people who are supposed to take care of you sometimes don't, and that surviving that isn't the same as being fixed by it, and that both things can be true at once. I think about the version of Vanessa I met at that first family dinner, before any of this, funny and confident and full of plans, and I think about how much easier this would all be if she'd simply been cruel from the start, easy to spot, easy to warn people about. She wasn't. She was a person under real financial pressure who decided, somewhere along the way, that a sick child's medicine was a resource to be managed rather than a life to be protected, and she believed her own justifications enough to look two paramedics in the eye and laugh. That's the part I still find myself turning over some nights. Not the theft itself, but the ease of the laugh. How practiced it must have been to get that smooth. My stepmother mocked a disease that was quietly, methodically trying to kill me, right up until two strangers in uniforms did what none of us in that family had managed to do for a year and a half. They asked the obvious question out loud, and they waited for an answer that never came. I got my answer anyway. It just took a camera, a hospital social worker, and a mother 2 hours away who noticed a lot number that didn't match. I didn't get my stepmother back because there was never really a version of her worth getting back. What I lost instead was smaller and harder to name. The version of a blended family I'd let myself hope for during those 6 good months. The mantle with room for 2 mothers worth of photographs. The idea that loss doesn't have to keep multiplying once it starts. I still miss that hope sometimes, even knowing what I know now. I don't think that makes me foolish. I think it just makes me someone who wanted, reasonably, to have more people in her corner instead of fewer. What I got instead is this: a kitchen drawer nobody moves. A father whose attention doesn't have a splinter of doubt behind it anymore. A grandmother in a folding chair at every game, writing things down. A body that isn't being sabotaged by someone who was supposed to be protecting it. It isn't everything I wanted at 14, sitting in that hospital bed learning to count carbohydrates for the first time, hoping the hardest part was already behind me. But it's mine, uncontested, unlocked, sitting exactly where I left it. Some nights that feels like more than enough. Most nights, if I'm honest, it feels like exactly enough.